Picture this. Thanksgiving afternoon, the smell of roasted turkey filling every corner of my parents' ranch house, and I'm walking down the hallway carrying a stack of folding chairs when I hear it. Soft crying coming from the guest bathroom. Not the kind of tears you shed over a touching holiday movie or a sentimental memory. These were the broken sobs of someone trying desperately to stay silent. Someone who had become an expert at swallowing their pain. I set down the chairs and knocked gently. The crying stopped immediately, replaced by frantic movement and running water. When the door finally opened, my baby sister Natalie stood there with makeup running down her cheeks and a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. But it wasn't the ruined mascara that made my blood run cold. It was the dark purple bruise blooming across her left cheekbone, barely concealed by foundation 3 shades too heavy. It was the way she held her ribs when she moved. It was the split in her lower lip that she tried to hide by biting it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That's when 3 years of Navy SEAL training and 4 combat deployments crystallized into a single, burning purpose. My little sister, the girl who used to make me friendship bracelets and leave encouraging notes in my deployment care packages, had become someone else's punching bag. Blake Porter, her husband of 3 years, the man who stood in our parents' living room right now laughing at my dad's jokes and complimenting my mum's cooking, had put his hands on her. And from the practiced way Natalie tried to cover the evidence, from the haunted look in her eyes, I knew this wasn't the first time. Not even close. What Blake didn't know as he sat there playing the perfect son-in-law was that I had spent the last decade learning exactly how to handle men who hurt, people weaker than themselves. He didn't know that I had access to resources, training, and a network of brothers who would move heaven and earth to protect one of our own. He didn't know that before the weekend was over, every secret he'd been hiding would be dragged into the light. He didn't know that the surveillance skills I'd honed, tracking high-value targets in hostile territory, were about to be turned on him. And he definitely didn't know that the friendly, easygoing brother-in-law he'd been dismissing for 3 years was actually someone who had been trained by the United States government to be very, very good at making bad people face consequences. By Sunday night, Blake Porter would learn what happens when a predator becomes prey. His carefully constructed image would shatter. His control would evaporate. And he would understand, with absolute clarity, that he had made the catastrophic mistake of hurting someone under my protection. This isn't just a story about confronting an abuser. This is about the moment when silence becomes testimony, when fear transforms into fury, and when a trained warrior remembers that his first mission has always been protecting his family. This is the story of how one Thanksgiving dinner became a reckoning that a coward would never forget. My name is Marcus Davidson, though everyone who matters calls me Mark, and at 34 years old, I thought I'd seen the worst that humanity had to offer. 8 years as a Navy SEAL will do that to you. I'd conducted hostage rescues in countries most Americans couldn't find on a map. I'd stared down armed insurgents who were willing to die for their cause. I'd held dying teammates in my arms and made split-second decisions that meant the difference between going home alive or in a flag-draped coffin. After all that, I'd transitioned to civilian life 2 years ago, settling in Austin and building a security consulting business that let me use my skills without the constant deployments and the weight of carrying a rifle into combat zones where every shadow might hide an enemy. My life had found a rhythm that felt sustainable. I worked with corporate clients who needed threat assessments and security protocols. I volunteered at the Veteran Support Center twice a week, helping younger guys process their transition from military to civilian life. I had a small house in a quiet neighborhood, a dog named Ranger who was better company than most people, and enough contract work to keep me comfortable without drowning in the corporate ladder climbing that seemed to consume everyone else in Austin's booming tech scene. On paper, I was one of the successful transition stories, the kind of veteran who figured out how to take his military experience and build something meaningful in the civilian world. But the truth was that part of me still felt adrift. In the teams, your purpose was crystal clear. You trained together, deployed together, and trusted each other with your life in ways that civilians could never fully understand. Every mission had objectives, timelines, and a clear definition of success or failure. The bonds you formed weren't just friendships, they were the kind of soul-deep connections that came from shared hardship and absolute mutual reliance. When I left that world, I'd lost more than a job. I'd lost a brotherhood and a sense of mission that civilian life couldn't quite replace. no matter how meaningful the work or how comfortable the paycheck. My family had always been my anchor through everything. My parents, Robert and Linda Davidson, had given my sister and me the kind of stable, loving childhood that military recruiters probably hated because it didn't come with the dysfunction that often drove young men to seek purpose in uniform. My dad had spent 30 years as a firefighter in Cedar Park before retiring, and my mum had worked as a nurse at the local hospital for just as long. They were solid people who believed in hard work, treating others with respect, and showing up for your community. The kind of folks who still knew all their neighbors by name and brought casseroles when someone was going through hard times. Natalie was 5 years younger than me, and growing up, I'd taken my role as big brother with the kind of seriousness that probably annoyed her more than protected her. I'd scared off questionable boyfriends in high school, taught her how to change a tire and check her oil, and made sure she understood that she deserved to be treated with respect by anyone lucky enough to be in her life. She'd gone to college at UT Austin, gotten her teaching degree, and landed a job at Meadowbrook Elementary in Lakewood, a suburban community about 3 hours southeast of Austin in the greater Houston area. She was one of those teachers who poured her whole heart into her students, the kind who spent her own money on classroom supplies and stayed late to tutor kids who were struggling. When she'd started dating Blake Porter 4 years ago, I'd had reservations from the beginning. There was something about him that didn't sit right with me, though I couldn't point to anything specific enough to justify my unease to Natalie or my parents. Blake came from money, the kind of generational wealth that came with a sense of entitlement and a belief that the normal rules didn't apply to people like him. His family owned commercial real estate across the Houston area, and Blake had leveraged those connections into a position at Porter Financial Group, the investment firm his uncle had founded. He drove a Mercedes, wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and had the kind of polished charm that seemed calculated rather than genuine. But Natalie had been swept up in his attention. Blake knew how to play the role of devoted boyfriend during their courtship. He sent flowers to her classroom, planned elaborate date nights, and talked about building a future together in ways that made her feel cherished and prioritized. My parents had liked him well enough, impressed by his apparent success and his respectful manners during family gatherings. When Blake proposed after a year of dating, presenting Natalie with a ring that probably cost more than my first car, she'd said yes, without hesitation. The wedding had been at a country club in Houston, a lavish affair that Blake's family had insisted on hosting, and I'd stood there in my dress uniform as one of the groomsmen, watching my little sister marry a man I instinctively didn't trust, while telling myself that maybe I was just being an overprotective brother who needed to let her make her own choices. The first year of their marriage had seemed fine from the outside. Natalie and Blake bought a house in Pinehurst Estates, one of those planned communities where every lawn looked identical, and the homeowners association had rules about what color you could paint your mailbox. Natalie continued teaching, though Blake made comments during family gatherings about how she didn't really need to work given his income, suggesting in ways that sounded like jokes, but carried an edge that she should focus on making their home perfect and preparing for the children they'd eventually have. She'd laugh it off, but I noticed how the light in her eyes dimmed slightly each time he made those comments. How she'd change the subject quickly, as if she'd learned that disagreeing led to conversations she didn't want to have in front of family. By the second year, the changes in Natalie became more noticeable to those of us who knew her well. She'd always been social, the kind of person who organized girls' nights with her teacher friends and never missed family gatherings. But gradually, she started declining invitations, offering excuses about Blake's work schedule or home projects they needed to complete. When she did show up for family events, she seemed diminished somehow, quieter and more careful with her words. She'd check her phone constantly, and I'd catch her tensing up when texts came through, though she'd smile and say everything was fine if anyone asked. Her best friend Claire had mentioned to my mum that Natalie had become harder to reach, that she'd stopped joining their weekly happy hours and seemed to always have reasons why she couldn't meet up. The third year of their marriage brought changes that were impossible to ignore, though Natalie had become skilled at deflecting concern. She'd lost weight in a way that didn't look healthy, her cheekbones more pronounced and her clothes hanging looser. There were incidents that she explained away with stories that got increasingly elaborate. A sprained wrist from tripping over Ranger when she'd been watching him for me during a business trip. A black eye from walking into a cabinet door she'd left open while cooking. Bruises on her arms that she attributed to her general clumsiness, laughing about how she'd never been coordinated. Each explanation came with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and a quick change of subject that discouraged follow-up questions. I'd tried to talk to her directly several times over the past year, choosing moments when Blake wasn't around and creating opportunities for honest conversation. Each time, she'd deflected with the skill of someone who'd been practicing her denials. Everything was fine, she'd insist. Marriage was just harder than people admitted, and she and Blake were working through normal adjustment issues that all couples faced. Blake was under a lot of stress at work, and she was learning how to be a better partner during those challenging times. The explanations always carried an undercurrent of her taking responsibility for problems she wouldn't quite name, as if she'd internalized the message that whatever was wrong in her marriage was somehow her fault for not being enough or doing enough or understanding enough. My parents had their own concerns, though they expressed them carefully, not wanting to overstep boundaries or make accusations they couldn't prove. My mom had mentioned noticing that Natalie seemed anxious whenever Blake was around, watching him constantly as if monitoring his mood and adjusting her behavior accordingly. My dad had commented on how Blake dominated conversations during family gatherings, cutting Natalie off mid-sentence or correcting her version of events in ways that made her shrink into herself.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But they were from a generation that believed you didn't interfere in a marriage unless you had concrete evidence of abuse, and Natalie's explanations for her injuries, however implausible, gave them just enough plausible deniability to not force a confrontation they feared might push her away entirely. I'd consulted with Derek Hayes, my closest friend from my SEAL days, who was still active duty and stationed at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, about 3 hours south of Houston. Derek and I had gone through BU at Essex together, that brutal 6-month selection course that breaks most men who attempt it, and we'd served on the same team for 5 years before my transition to civilian life. He was one of the few people who understood both the tactical side of my training and the protective instincts that came with being a big brother to someone you'd loved since the day she was born. When I described Natalie's situation during one of our regular check-in calls, Derek had been direct in a way that only a true friend could be. The pattern I was describing sounded exactly like the domestic violence cases he'd seen among military families during his time as a casualty assistance officer, a role he'd filled for 2 years that involved supporting families who'd lost service members or were dealing with serious crises. The escalating isolation, the increasing injuries with increasingly implausible explanations, the weight loss and anxiety, the way Natalie had learned to manage Blake's moods and take responsibility for his behavior. These weren't signs of normal marital stress. These were textbook indicators of an abusive relationship that was escalating in severity and frequency. Derek had encouraged me to document everything I observed, to maintain detailed records of dates and injuries and concerning behaviors, and to start building a case that could support Natalie when she was finally ready to leave. Because in his experience, victims of domestic violence rarely left the first time someone confronted them about the abuse. They needed evidence, support systems, and a plan that addressed the very real dangers of leaving an abuser who wouldn't accept the loss of control. I'd started keeping that documentation 3 months earlier, creating an encrypted file on my laptop that recorded every concerning interaction, every injury, every change in Natalie's behavior or appearance. I'd taken photos during family gatherings when I could do so without being obvious, capturing images that showed her weight loss, her anxiety, the way she flinched when Blake moved suddenly. I'd saved text message conversations where she'd cancelled plans at the last minute, often with excuses that mentioned Blake's preferences or demands. I was building a case the way I'd been trained to build intelligence packages on high-value targets, systematically collecting information that painted a picture more damning than any single piece of evidence could convey on its own. But documentation felt passive and inadequate when every instinct I possessed screamed that my sister was in danger. The training that had been drilled into me during my years as a SEAL emphasized patience, thorough planning, and waiting for the right moment to act. But that same training had also taught me to trust my gut when it was telling me that a situation was deteriorating and that waiting might mean being too late. I'd seen what happened when people ignored warning signs because they wanted more proof or clearer evidence. I'd conducted hostage rescues where victims had been held for months because intelligence analysts wanted to be absolutely certain before authorizing an operation, and sometimes that caution cost lives that might have been saved with faster action. The tension between my protective instincts and the knowledge that I couldn't force Natalie to leave her marriage had been eating at me for months. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, that dead hour when the mind cycles through worst-case scenarios and imagine scenarios where Blake's violence escalated beyond bruises and sprains to something irreversible. I'd run through tactical plans for extracting Natalie from her house if she called me in crisis, mapping exit routes and identifying resources she'd need. I'd even driven to Lakewood on 2 occasions, parking down the street from her house for hours just to make sure she was okay, watching for any signs of immediate danger that would justify knocking on the door and forcing a confrontation. This Thanksgiving was supposed to be a normal family gathering, the kind we'd had every year of my life. My parents had invited Natalie and Blake to spend the holiday weekend at their place in Cedar Park, making it clear that both of them were welcome, but that Natalie was expected regardless of Blake's work schedule or other obligations. It was my mom's gentle way of ensuring she'd have eyes on Natalie for more than a few hours at a public restaurant where Blake's behavior would be carefully controlled. The plan was simple: Thursday for the traditional Thanksgiving meal, Friday for leftover sandwiches and football games, and Saturday for the annual Davidson family tradition of putting up Christmas decorations while listening to holiday music that my dad considered essential to the process. Blake had seemed annoyed by the expectation of spending an entire weekend with his in-laws, though he'd hidden it behind his usual polished charm. When my mom had called too, coordinate timing and dietary restrictions. He'd mentioned having important client meetings scheduled for Friday morning that he really shouldn't miss, suggesting that maybe he and Natalie could just come for Thursday and head back to Lakewood that evening. My mum had been surprisingly firm, pointing out that family time was important and that surely his clients would understand that even successful financial managers took holiday weekends off. Blake had agreed with the kind of gracious acceptance that somehow still conveyed his displeasure, and I'd wondered what price Natalie would pay later for his being forced to comply with expectations he resented. They'd arrived at my parents' house around 2 o'clock Thursday afternoon, pulling up in Blake's Mercedes that always looked absurdly out of place in the driveway next to my dad's 15-year-old pickup truck and my mom's practical Honda. I'd been there since morning, helping my dad with the last-minute preparations that had become our tradition. We'd set up the folding tables and extra chairs that would accommodate the extended family members who'd be arriving later. We'd move furniture to create better traffic flow for the buffet-style meal my mom preferred because it let people serve themselves and mingle, rather than being trapped in assigned seats. We'd tested the sound system for the football games that would play in the background, providing ambient entertainment for those who cared about sports and easy conversation topics for those who didn't. When Natalie climbed out of the passenger seat, my immediate impression was that she looked exhausted in a way that went beyond normal holiday stress, or the fatigue of a 3-hour drive. Her smile was practiced and didn't reach her eyes. She was wearing a turtleneck despite the mild November Texas weather, and sunglasses that seemed unnecessary given the overcast sky. She moved carefully, with the kind of deliberate precision that people use when they're in pain, but trying to hide it. Blake, in contrast, bounded out of the driver's seat with his characteristic energy, already launching into a story about the traffic they'd encountered and the incompetent drivers who'd made their journey longer than necessary. My mum had hugged Natalie with the kind of extended embrace that mothers use when they're trying to communicate love and concern without words, holding on just a beat too long while studying her daughter's face for signs of whatever she feared finding there. My dad had shaken Blake's hand with his usual cordial warmth, though I noticed he didn't engage in the kind of extended conversation he usually enjoyed with family members who'd just arrived. I'd hung back slightly, observing the dynamics and noting the way Natalie positioned herself in relation to Blake, staying within his line of sight and seeming to gauge his mood before deciding how to respond to our parents' questions about their drive and their plans for the weekend. The afternoon had proceeded with the organized chaos typical of Davidson family Thanksgiving celebrations. Relatives arrived in waves, filling the house with noise and laughter, and the competing smells of different dishes being kept warm in the kitchen. Blake had positioned himself in the living room with the other men, dominating conversations about financial markets and real estate investments, with the easy confidence of someone who assumed his opinions were more valuable than anyone else's. Natalie had retreated to the kitchen with the women, helping my mom and aunts with final preparations, while fielding questions about her teaching, and her students with answers that sounded rehearsed rather than spontaneous. I'd found myself watching them both throughout the afternoon, my observation skills honed by years of surveillance training identifying patterns in their interaction. Blake monitored Natalie's location constantly, his eyes tracking her movement whenever she left his sight line, for more than a few minutes. When she laughed at someone's joke in the kitchen, a genuine sound that reminded me of the sister I'd grown up with, Blake's expression tightened in a way that most people wouldn't notice, but that I recognized as displeasure. When she'd taken longer than he apparently expected helping my mum find serving platters in the garage storage, Blake had appeared in the kitchen doorway with a smile that didn't match the tension in his posture, suggesting that maybe she should take a break since she'd been working so hard all afternoon. That's when she'd excused herself to the bathroom, and I'd been in the hallway with those folding chairs when I heard the crying that changed everything. The bathroom door opened slowly, and Natalie stood there with water still dripping from her hands where she'd clearly been splashing her face in a desperate attempt to erase the evidence of her breakdown. Her eyes were red and swollen despite her efforts, and up close, the bruise on her. Her cheekbone was impossible to miss. The foundation she'd applied with shaking hands had settled into the creases around the swelling, making it more obvious rather than less. But what made my chest tighten with a rage I hadn't felt since watching insurgents execute civilians was the carefully blank expression she'd arranged on her face, the look of someone who'd had extensive practice pretending everything was fine when their world was crumbling. "Hey, Mark," she said, her voice artificially bright in that way people use when they're trying to convince themselves as much as anyone else that they're okay. I just needed a minute. You know how overwhelming these big family gatherings can be? All the noise and the questions about when we're having kids and everything. I'm fine, really. Just needed to collect myself before going back out there. The lie hung between us like smoke, visible and toxic. I'd spent years learning to read people in situations where misreading intent could get you killed. I'd interrogated enemy combatants who were trained to resist questioning, and I'd worked with intelligence analysts who could spot deception in the smallest micro-expressions. Natalie was my sister, and I'd known her since she was born. There was no universe in which I was going to accept this performance as truth. I stepped into the bathroom and closed the door behind me, keeping my voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the rest of the house where our family was gathered in cheerful oblivion. "Natalie, look at me. Really look at me. I'm not mom who wants to believe everything is fine. I'm not dad who doesn't know how to ask the hard questions. I'm your brother, and I've seen enough violence in my life to recognize what it looks like when someone has been hurt by someone they trust." She opened her mouth to protest, to launch into whatever explanation she'd prepared for the bruise and the split lip and the way she was holding her ribs, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Before you tell me you fell or walked into something or had some clumsy accident, I need you to understand something. I've spent the last 3 months documenting every injury you've explained away, every cancelled plan, every time you've flinched when Blake moved too quickly, every pound you've lost, every excuse you've made for why you can't meet up with Claire or why you had to leave family gatherings early. I have photos and text messages and a timeline that would make it very clear to anyone who looked at it that you're in an abusive relationship." The color drained from Natalie's face, and for a moment I thought she might collapse. She grabbed the edge of the sink to steady herself, her knuckles going white with the force of her grip. Her eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from the ones she'd been crying when I found her. These were tears of exposure, of having the secret she'd been protecting suddenly dragged into the light whether she was ready or not. "You don't understand," she whispered, and the defeat in her voice was worse than any physical injury I could see. "It's not that simple. Blake is under so much pressure at work, and his family has these expectations, and I haven't been the wife he needs me to be. If I could just figure out how to not upset him, how to do things the right way, then everything would be fine. He's not a bad person, Mark. He just gets frustrated when I mess things up." The textbook abuse victim language coming from my sister's mouth felt like a punch to the gut. This was exactly what Derek had warned me about, the way victims internalize blame and made excuses for their abusers. But hearing it from Natalie, hearing her defend the man who had put bruises on her face, activated something primal in me that had nothing to do with my SEAL training and everything to do with being a big brother who'd spent his whole life protecting her. I moved closer, gentle in my approach because I could see how fragile she was in this moment, how close to breaking. "Natalie, listen to me very carefully. Nothing you could possibly do justifies him putting his hands on you. Not burning dinner, not forgetting something he asked you to do, not having your own opinions or your own friends, or your own life. A real man, a good man, doesn't hurt the woman he promised to love and protect. Ever. For any reason." She started crying in earnest then, the kind of deep, racking sobs that come from years of suppressed pain finally finding release. I pulled her into a hug, feeling how thin she'd become, how she trembled against me like a small animal that had been cornered too many times. She cried into my shoulder while I held her, one hand on the back of her head, like I used to do when she was little and had nightmares, the other wrapped around her back in a way that was careful of what I suspected were more injuries hidden beneath her clothes. "It's been so bad, Mark," she finally said when the sobs had subsided enough for her to speak. "It's been so bad for so long, and I don't know how to make it stop. I tried leaving once, about 6 months ago. I packed a bag and made it as far as the driveway before he found me. He didn't hit me that time. He just cried and apologized and promised he'd change. And I believed him because I wanted so desperately for it to be true. But it got worse after that. Like he was punishing me for trying to leave. And he started saying things about how, if I ever tried to embarrass him by leaving or telling anyone, he'd make sure everyone knew what a terrible wife I'd been. He'd ruin my reputation, make sure I lost my teaching job, turn our families against me. The admission confirmed what I'd suspected but had hoped wasn't true. This wasn't occasional violence born of stress that might be addressed through counseling or anger management. This was systematic abuse by a man who used fear and manipulation to maintain control, who understood exactly how to isolate his victim and make her believe she had no options beyond enduring his violence. Blake Porter was a predator who'd chosen his victim carefully, courting her with charm and romance before gradually revealing his true nature once she was legally bound to him and he believed she was trapped. "Has he ever threatened to kill you?" I asked, keeping my voice calm despite the fury building in my chest. Because that's important for what happens next. If he's made specific threats about what he'll do if you leave, we need to treat this as a lethal force situation. Natalie pulled back slightly to look at me, confusion and fear mixing in her expression. "What do you mean? What happens next?" "Mark, you can't do anything. If you confront him, it'll just make everything worse for me. He'll know I told you, and he'll be so angry. And I'm the one who has to live with the consequences of that anger. Please, just pretend you didn't see anything. Let me handle this my own way." The plea in her voice was heartbreaking, but it also clarified exactly what needed to happen. Natalie had been conditioned to prioritize Blake's reactions over her own safety, to manage his emotions at the expense of her own well-being. She'd lost the ability to see herself as someone worthy of protection, someone whose safety mattered more than avoiding her abuser's displeasure. My job now wasn't to convince her to leave, though that was the ultimate goal. My job was to gather enough evidence to make leaving not just possible but safe, to build a case so airtight that Blake couldn't manipulate his way out of consequences. "I'm not going to confront him today," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I'm not going to do anything that puts you in immediate danger. But I need you to understand that this ends now, not tomorrow or next week or after the holidays. The violence stops today, and we're going to make sure it never happens again. I have resources you don't know about, training you've never seen me use, and a network of people who specialize in exactly this kind of situation." Natalie shook her head, fresh panic crossing her face. "Mark, no. You don't understand how powerful his family is. His uncle practically owns half of Houston. They have lawyers and connections and money, and they'll destroy anyone who tries to cause problems for Blake. I've seen what they do to people who cross them. One of his co-workers tried to report him for workplace harassment last year, and within a month she'd been fired and blacklisted from every financial firm in the city. They're untouchable. The information about workplace harassment was new and valuable, another piece of the pattern that suggested Blake's violence wasn't limited to his home life. If he'd been reported for harassment at work, there would be documentation somewhere, even if his family's influence had buried the formal complaint. That was the kind of corroborating evidence that could prove this wasn't an isolated incident of marital discord, but a pattern of predatory behavior spanning multiple contexts and victims. "They're not untouchable," I said with the quiet confidence that came from having actually faced people who were genuinely dangerous, not just wealthy bullies who'd never been meaningfully challenged. They think they're untouchable because they've bought their way out of consequences their whole lives. But money and connections have limits, especially when you're dealing with someone who knows how to operate outside the systems they've learned to manipulate. I need you to trust me on this. Can you do that? She studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her processing what I was really saying. Natalie was smart enough to understand that my military background meant I had capabilities most civilians didn't, that my training had prepared me for situations far more dangerous than dealing with an abusive corporate executive. But I could also see her fear, the way years of Blake's psychological conditioning had convinced her that resistance was futile and that any attempt to escape would only make her situation worse. "What are you going to do?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "And please don't lie to me about this. I need to know what I'm agreeing to." I respected her need for honesty, even though part of me wanted to shield her from the details of what I was planning. "First, I'm going to document your injuries properly. That means photos in good lighting that clearly show the bruising and any other injuries you're hiding. I know a doctor at the Veteran Support Center who handles domestic violence cases, and she'll be willing to see you today if I call her. We need medical documentation that's time-stamped and official, not just my phone pictures." Natalie's hand went instinctively to her ribs, confirming my suspicion that there were injuries beyond what was visible on her face. "How did you know?" "Because I've seen enough violence to recognize when someone is protecting broken or bruised ribs," I said gently. "And because you winced when Mom hugged you earlier. Medical documentation is crucial because it creates a record that Blake can't explain away or claim is fabricated after the fact. It's also important for your own health. If you have broken ribs, they need to be properly treated before you develop complications." She nodded slowly, the fight draining out of her as she accepted the reality of what needed to happen. "What else?" "Second, I'm going to reach out to someone I trust who still has connections in law enforcement. We need to know if Blake has any prior complaints or incidents that his family managed to bury. Criminal history, restraining orders from previous relationships, anything that establishes a pattern. I'm also going to look into that workplace harassment complaint you mentioned, because if we can find the woman who filed it and get her to talk about what happened, that's additional evidence that Blake's behavior isn't isolated to your marriage." Natalie wrapped her arms around herself, a protective gesture that made her look small and vulnerable in a way that broke my heart. "She won't talk. Blake's family made sure she signed an NDA as part of her severance package. She can't say anything about what happened without facing huge financial penalties. NDAs have limitations," I said, thinking through the legal angles. "They typically can't prevent someone from reporting crimes or cooperating with law enforcement investigations. If we can establish that Blake's behavior rises to the level of criminal assault or harassment, her NDA might not protect him the way his family thinks it does. But that's a bridge we'll cross when we get there. For now, we focus on documenting everything that's happened to you. Third, I'm going to install security cameras at your house, ones that Blake won't know about. Small, wireless units that upload footage to a secure cloud server that only you and I can access. They'll be positioned to capture common areas where his violence typically occurs. If he puts his hands on you again, we'll have video evidence that's undeniable." Natalie's eyes widened with alarm. "He'll find them. Blake checks everything. He goes through my phone, my computer, my car. He's obsessive about making sure I'm not hiding anything from him." "He won't find these," I assured her. "They're military-grade surveillance equipment designed to be completely invisible unless you know exactly what you're looking for. I'll install them when he's at work, and I'll show you how to access the footage remotely so you can check it without leaving any trace on your devices. This is what I do for a living now, Natalie. Security consulting means I know every trick for both installing surveillance and avoiding detection." She was quiet for a moment, processing the scope of what I was proposing. "This feels like we're going to war." "We are," I said bluntly. "But it's a war. Blake started the first time he put his hands on you, and it's a war. He's going to lose because he's never faced an opponent who actually knows how to fight back. Every battle he's won up until now has been against someone who was weaker, isolated, and convinced they had no options. That changes today." A knock on the bathroom door interrupted our conversation, and my mum's voice came through with concern that she was trying to keep casual. "Everything okay in there? Natalie, honey, your face looked a little flushed. Are you feeling all right?" Natalie straightened immediately, years of hiding her reality kicking in automatically. "I'm fine, Mom. Just got a little overheated helping in the kitchen. Mark was just checking on me. We'll be out in a minute." My mum hesitated on the other side of the door, and I could practically feel her maternal instinct warring with her desire to respect her adult daughter's privacy. "All right, well, dinner is about to be served. Your father is starting to carve the turkey, and you know how he gets when people aren't in there seats for his big presentation. The attempt at normalcy, at pretending this was just another family holiday, felt obscene given what I'd just learned. But it also reminded me that we were surrounded by relatives who had no idea what was really happening, and that maintaining the facade for a few more hours was necessary to avoid tipping off Blake before I had all my pieces in place. "We'll be right there," I called back, then turned to Natalie and lowered my voice again. "Here's what's going to happen for the rest of today. You're going to go out there and play the role you've been playing. Smile when expected. Laugh at the right moments. Let Blake think everything is exactly as he believes it to be. Can you do that for a few more hours?" She nodded, though I could see how much the prospect exhausted her. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to watch him. Really watch him. With eyes he doesn't know, are trained to catch every tell, every micro-expression, every moment where his mask slips. I'm going to document how he treats you when he thinks no one important is paying attention. And I'm going to start making calls to people who can help us build the kind of case that will make it impossible for his family's money and influence to protect him from consequences." Natalie reached out and grabbed my hand, squeezing it with surprising strength, given how defeated she'd seemed moments before. "Thank you. I know I should have told you sooner. I know I should have asked for help before it got this bad. But I was so ashamed, Mark. I felt like such a failure for not being able to make my marriage work, for not being strong enough to just leave." The shame in her voice was familiar from the dozens of domestic violence cases I'd learned about through my work at the Veterans Support Center. Abusers were expert at making their victims feel responsible for the abuse, at convincing them that the violence was a natural consequence of their own inadequacy, rather than a choice the abuser was making. Breaking through that internalized shame was often harder than dealing with the physical violence itself. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," I said firmly. "Blake is the one who should be ashamed. His family should be ashamed for raising a man who thinks violence is an acceptable way to treat the woman he married. But you survived. You kept teaching your students and showing up for your life even while dealing with this nightmare at home. That's not weakness. That's strength most people can't even imagine." We stood there for another moment, brother and sister in a bathroom at a family Thanksgiving, the sounds of laughter and conversation filtering through the door, like they were coming from another world entirely. Then Natalie took a deep breath, wiped her eyes one final time, and arranged her face into the smile she'd perfected over 3 years of hiding her reality. She opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, heading toward the dining room where our family was gathering and where Blake would be waiting to monitor her return. I gave her a 30-second head start, using those moments to pull out my phone and send 3 quick text messages. The first went to Derek Hayes, my SEAL brother, who would understand the situation immediately and know what resources I'd need. The message was brief and coded in a way that would make sense to him, but look innocuous to anyone else who might see it. "Need to discuss that security consultation we talked about. Situation has escalated. Can you call me tonight after 2200 hours? The second message went to Dr. Patricia Flores, the physician I'd met through my volunteer work at the Veterans Support Center. Patricia specialized in treating veterans with PTSD and trauma-related injuries, but she'd also done extensive work with domestic violence victims and understood the importance of proper documentation. I kept the message professional but urgent. "Dr. Flores, this is Marcus Davidson. I have a family member in immediate need of medical documentation for injuries sustained in a domestic violence situation. Are you available for an emergency consultation today or tomorrow? This is time sensitive." The third message went to Raymond Kim, a detective with the Lakewood Police Department who I'd met during a security assessment I'd conducted for the city 6 months earlier. Raymond was former Army, and we'd bonded over shared military experience and a mutual frustration with how poorly civilian law enforcement often handled domestic violence cases. His message needed to be more carefully worded since I was essentially asking a police officer to look into someone who hadn't been formally reported. "Raymond, Marcus Davidson here. I need to pick your brain about a hypothetical domestic violence case involving a high-profile family in your jurisdiction. Nothing official yet, just trying to understand what evidence would be needed to build a solid case. Available for a call this weekend?" All 3 messages sent successfully, and I slipped my phone back into my pocket before heading toward the dining room, where my family was gathering around the table my dad had spent the afternoon setting up. The scene that greeted me was one I'd witnessed dozens of times before. My dad standing at the head of the table with the carving knife, preparing to perform his annual turkey carving ritual with commentary that he found hilarious and everyone else tolerated with good-natured eye rolls. My mum was directing relatives to their seats with the organizational precision she'd honed over decades of hosting family gatherings. Aunts and uncles and cousins were finding their places, passing dishes and pouring drinks, and engaging in the comfortable chaos that defined Davidson family celebrations. And there, in the middle of it all, was Blake Porter. He'd positioned himself next to Natalie, one hand resting possessively on the back of her chair, his expression one of benevolent patience as he tolerated the family dynamics he clearly considered beneath his usual social circle. He was playing the role of devoted husband perfectly, leaning over occasionally to whisper something in Natalie's ear that made her smile in that careful, measured way she'd developed. To anyone who didn't know what to look for, they appeared to be a normal couple enjoying a holiday with family. But I knew what to look for now. I watched as Blake's hand moved from the back of Natalie's chair to her shoulder, his grip tightening just slightly when she laughed at something our cousin said. A subtle reminder of his control that only she would feel. I watched as his eyes tracked her every movement, monitoring who she talked to and how animated she became in those conversations. I watched as he leaned in again, his mouth close to her ear, and saw the way her entire body tensed before she nodded slightly, and her smile became more fixed. I took my own seat across the table from them, positioning myself, where I'd have a clear line of sight to Blake's face throughout the meal. My dad launched into his traditional Thanksgiving speech about gratitude and family, and the importance of staying connected even as everyone got older and busier with their own lives. People bowed their heads as he said grace, thanking God for blessings and asking for continued health and happiness for everyone gathered around the table. The irony of asking for happiness and health, while my sister sat there with bruises hidden under makeup and injuries concealed beneath carefully chosen clothing, was almost too much to bear. But I kept my expression neutral, playing my own role in this performance while my mind worked through the tactical considerations of what came next. Dinner proceeded with the usual conversations and passing of dishes. Blake dominated discussions at his end of the table, holding forth on economic indicators and investment strategies in ways that were clearly designed to demonstrate his superior knowledge and sophistication. He mentioned the names of wealthy clients and successful deals with the casual arrogance of someone who measured his worth by his financial achievements. Several times I noticed him correct or contradict Natalie when she tried to contribute to conversations, doing it in ways that seemed helpful to others, but that I recognized as calculated put-downs designed to remind her of her place. My phone buzzed in my pocket with responses to my earlier messages. Derek's text came first, brief and direct. "Roger that. We'll call it 2200, standing by for whatever you need." Dr. Flores responded next with the compassion that had made her so effective with trauma victims. "Marcus, I'm so sorry your family's dealing with this. I can see your family member tomorrow at my home office, away from the hospital where there would be more questions and paperwork. Text me in the morning with timing. Document everything you can tonight." Raymond Kim's message. Took longer to arrive, but when it came through, it was exactly what I needed to hear. "Sorry to hear about your hypothetical situation. Real talk though, Blake Porter? I've heard things through channels about that family. Nothing that's stuck yet, but there's smoke there. Call me tomorrow and let's discuss what a real case would need to look like." The fact that Raymond recognized Blake's name immediately told me everything I needed to know about whether my sister's situation was as unique as Blake wanted her to believe. If a detective in Lakewood already had Blake Porter on his radar, there were other victims, other incidents that hadn't been properly investigated or prosecuted. The pattern was bigger than just what Natalie had experienced, and that meant there were potentially other people who could provide testimony and evidence once we opened this case up properly. I looked up from my phone to find Blake staring directly at me, his expression curious but with an edge I didn't like. "Something interesting on your phone, Mark? Work emergency? I know you security consultant types are always on call, dealing with one crisis or another." The comment was designed to sound friendly, but there was a challenge in it, a subtle assertion of dominance from a man who needed to establish his position in any social hierarchy. He was testing whether I'd defer to him, apologize for being distracted during family time, and confirm his belief that he was the most important person in any room he occupied. "Just coordinating some weekend plans," I replied evenly, maintaining eye contact in a way that made clear I wasn't intimidated by his implicit challenge. "Nothing that can't wait until after dinner. This meal my mum and dad put together deserves our full attention." Blake smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, family time is sacred, though I have to admit, I'll be glad when we can head back home tomorrow. I know Natalie misses sleeping in her own bed, and I have some client meetings that really shouldn't be delayed any longer than necessary. The casual announcement that he was planning to cut the visit short contradicted the agreement he'd made with my mom about staying through the weekend. It was classic Blake behavior. Agreeing to something when refusing would make him look bad, then finding ways to undermine that agreement once he'd gotten what he wanted in the moment. But more importantly, it signaled that he was eager to get Natalie away from her family and back under his complete control, where whatever had caused her injuries today could be properly reinforced without the risk of exposure. Actually, my mum interjected with surprising firmness, I was hoping you two could stay through Saturday at least. It's been so long since we've had a full weekend with Natalie, and there's that Christmas decoration tradition tomorrow that she's always loved. Plus, I made way too much food, and someone needs to help us eat all these leftovers before they go bad. Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and I saw his hand move to Natalie's thigh under the table, squeezing in a way that I knew from experience meant pain delivered where no one else could see. Natalie's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and her smile became even more fixed as she processed whatever silent message Blake was sending through that grip. We'd love to stay, Mom, Natalie said quickly, her voice carrying just a hint of strain that no one else would recognize as fear. Blake can probably handle his client meetings over the phone, right, honey? I know how much he values family time too. Blake's expression remained pleasant, but I'd spent enough time reading micro-expressions in hostile territory to see the fury simmering beneath his careful control. Of course, he agreed, his tone suggesting magnanimous accommodation rather than forced compliance. Whatever makes Natalie happy, that's always been my priority. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost admired the skill involved if it hadn't been directed at manipulating my sister and deceiving my family. Blake Porter had clearly spent years perfecting the art of appearing reasonable while exercising total control, of seeming accommodating while ensuring that every decision ultimately served his interests. But what he didn't understand was that I'd spent years in environments where reading people accurately was the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, where every word and gesture had to be analyzed for hidden meaning and deceptive intent. Dinner continued with forced normalcy for another hour. Dishes were passed around the table multiple times as people went back for seconds and thirds. My dad told stories about previous Thanksgivings that everyone had heard before, but that still generated fond laughter. My mum basked in the compliments about her cooking, deflecting praise with humble comments about how simple the recipes were and how anyone could make the same dishes if they just took the time. Extended family members caught up on each other's lives, sharing updates about jobs and health and grandchildren with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd known each other for decades. Through it all, I maintained my careful observation of Blake and Natalie. I watched as he controlled her portion sizes, commenting on how much she was eating with observations that sounded like concern but carried an undercurrent of criticism. She's been watching her figure lately, he said when my aunt offered Natalie a second helping of sweet potato casserole. Trying to get back to her wedding weight. I keep telling her she looks beautiful regardless, but you know how women get about these things. The comment drew sympathetic nods from some of the older relatives who didn't recognize it for what it was. Blake's way of controlling Natalie's eating while making it seem like health consciousness, rather than the deliberate starvation that had caused her dramatic weight loss. Natalie forced a smile and declined the casserole, though I'd seen her looking at it with the hunger of someone who wasn't being allowed to eat as much as her body needed. I also noted how Blake monitored Natalie's alcohol consumption, subtly moving her wine glass away from her when she reached for it, and replacing it with water while making jokes about lightweight drinkers who couldn't handle their liquor. The control was absolute and extended to every aspect of her behavior, from what she ate to what she drank to how long she spent talking to any particular person. It was the kind of comprehensive domination that required constant vigilance from the abuser and constant compliance from the victim. A dynamic that had clearly become so normalized in their relationship that Natalie responded to his cues without conscious thought. After dinner concluded and people began the traditional migration to different areas of the house for coffee and dessert, I engineered a moment alone with my dad. He'd retreated to the garage under the pretense of checking something in his toolbox, but I knew it was really his way of getting a few minutes of quiet after hours of hosting and conversation. I found him standing in front of his workbench, organizing tools that didn't need organizing, enjoying the solitude before the evening activities resumed. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something serious," I said, closing the garage door behind me to ensure privacy. "And I need you to listen without interrupting until I'm finished, because what I'm about to tell you is going to make you angry, and we can't afford for that anger to show until we've handled this properly." My father turned to face me, and I saw his expression shift from relaxed contentment to immediate alertness. He was a retired firefighter who'd spent 3 decades responding to emergencies, and he still had that ability to go from casual to focused in an instant when the situation demanded it. "What's going on?" "Blake is abusing Natalie," I said without preamble, knowing that direct communication would be more effective with my father than gentle lead-ins or euphemisms. "He's been hitting her, controlling her, and systematically isolating her from everyone who cares about her. The bruise on her face that she tried to cover with makeup, that's from him. The weight loss we've all noticed, he controls what she eats. The way she's become withdrawn and anxious. That's what happens when someone lives in constant fear of their partner's violence." My dad's face went through several rapid changes of expression as he processed what I was telling him. Shock, denial, fury, and finally a kind of sick recognition as pieces fell into place for him the way they had for me. The toolbox in his hand dropped to the workbench with a clatter that echoed in the quiet garage. I'd feared something like this, but I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. "Your mother and I have both noticed changes in her," but Natalie kept insisting everything was fine, and we didn't want to overstep. The guilt in his voice was understandable but misplaced, and I knew from my work with veterans dealing with trauma that guilt was a waste of energy better spent on constructive action. "There's no point in blaming yourself for not seeing it sooner. Abusers are experts at hiding their behavior and making their victims complicit in maintaining the deception. Blake has money, connections, and a carefully cultivated public image that makes it hard for people to believe he's capable of violence. But I've documented evidence, and I'm in the process of building a case that will make it impossible for him to continue hurting her." My dad's hands clenched into fists, and I could see him struggling with the same protective rage I'd been managing since finding Natalie in the bathroom. "What do you need from me? Because if you're telling me we need to handle this carefully instead of me going in there right now and beating that smug look off his face, there better be a damn good reason. The reason is that Natalie has to live with the consequences of whatever we do next," I said, understanding his impulse but knowing it would be counterproductive. "If you confront Blake now in front of the whole family, he'll know that she told us, and when they go home, whenever that happens, he'll punish her for exposing him. The violence will escalate, and she'll be alone with him when it does. We need to be strategic about this, build overwhelming evidence, get law enforcement involved properly, create a situation where Natalie can leave safely, and Blake faces real consequences rather than just embarrassment at a family gathering." My father took several deep breaths, visibly wrestling his emotions under control. "You're right. I know you're right. But Jesus, Mark. The thought of him sitting in my living room, eating my food, pretending to be part of this family while he's been hurting my little girl, I don't know how I'm going to get through the rest of this weekend without tearing him apart. You're going to get through it the same way Natalie has been getting through it for 3 years, I said quietly, by remembering that the short-term satisfaction of losing your temper isn't worth the long-term cost of making her situation worse. We play along for now, we smile and act normal, and let Blake think his secret is still safe. Meanwhile, I'm putting pieces in place that will destroy him completely. Not just physically, though, I won't lie and say that's not part of what I'm planning. But legally, financially, socially, by the time we're done, he won't just lose Natalie, he'll lose everything. The promise seemed to satisfy something in my father, giving him a goal to focus on rather than just impotent rage. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to keep Mum calm when I tell her, which I'll do tonight after Blake and Natalie have gone to bed in the guest room. She's going to want to confront Natalie, to mother her and ask 1,000 questions and probably cry a lot. But we can't do that until Blake is asleep or out of the house. I also need you and Mom to act completely normal around Blake for the rest of the weekend. Don't tip him off that anything has changed." "Can you do that?" My dad nodded slowly. "Your mother is going to take this hard. She's been worried about Natalie for months. asking me if I thought everything was okay with the marriage. This is going to confirm her worst fears, which is why we need to give her something constructive to do with those emotions, I said. Tomorrow, while Blake is hopefully distracted with his work calls, I need Mom to get Natalie out of the house for a few hours. Shopping, lunch, whatever excuse makes sense. During that time, I need to get Natalie alone so Dr. Flores can document her injuries properly, and so I can install surveillance equipment at their house. Having Mom as backup means Natalie won't be isolated with Blake if something goes wrong. How are you? Planning to get into their house without Blake knowing? My dad asked, his firefighter's practical problem-solving mind already working through the logistics. He strikes me as the type who'd have security systems and cameras and all that nonsense people with too much money think makes them safe. He does, I confirmed. But security systems are only as good as the people who install and monitor them, and most civilian security is designed to keep out opportunistic criminals, not someone with specialized training in infiltration and surveillance. I can be in and out of their house in under an hour, installing equipment that Blake won't find even if he's actively looking for it. The bigger challenge is making sure Natalie has a legitimate reason to be away from home that won't trigger his suspicion or control mechanisms. My father considered this. What if your mother invited Natalie to go Black Friday shopping? It's the day after Thanksgiving. Lots of women do it as a tradition. And Blake would look controlling and unreasonable if he tried to prevent her from spending time with her mother doing something completely normal and harmless. That's perfect, I said, genuinely impressed by the suggestion. Blake won't see it as threatening because it's such a stereotypical activity. Plus, it gives Mom something to look forward to, a mission that makes her feel like she's actively helping rather than just waiting around feeling helpless. We stood there in the garage for another moment, father and son, united in purpose the way we'd been throughout my childhood when tackling projects or solving problems. Then, my dad reached out and gripped my shoulder with the kind of fierce affection that military families understand better than most. I'm proud of you, son, not just for your service or your career or any of that, but for being the kind of man who stands up for people who can't protect themselves. Natalie is lucky to have you in her corner. She'd do the same for me, I said simply, because it was true. Natalie had written to me every single week during my deployments, sending care packages and encouragement and reminders of home, when I was in places that seemed very far from anything good or decent. She'd been my anchor during the hardest years of my life, and now it was my turn to be hers. We returned to the house separately, my dad going first to avoid anyone noticing we'd been alone together for too long. When I re-entered through the kitchen door a few minutes later, I found the family scattered throughout the main floor in various states of post-dinner relaxation. Some people were watching football games in the living room, their attention divided between the screen and conversations that ebbed and flowed with the action on the field. Others had gathered in the dining room for board games, the kind of competitive but friendly contests that had been Davidson family traditions for as long as I could remember. A few relatives had claimed spots in the den for quieter conversations over coffee and the pumpkin pie my mum had made from scratch. Blake had positioned himself in the living room with the football watchers, holding forth on sports statistics and player performance with the same confident authority he brought to every topic. Natalie sat beside him on the couch, her posture rigid and her hands folded in her lap, in a way that suggested she'd been instructed to stay close and visible, rather than drift off to conversations with other family members. Every few minutes, Blake would reach over to touch her arm or shoulder, gestures that probably looked affectionate to casual observers, but that I recognized as ownership displays and control mechanisms. I claimed a chair that gave me a clear view of both of them, while appearing to focus on the football game. My phone buzzed periodically with responses to various messages I'd sent during dinner. Derek confirmed he'd be calling at 10 o'clock as planned and asked if I needed backup beyond just advice and resources. I texted back that I'd let him know after we talked, but that having someone on standby might be useful depending on how the situation evolved. Dr. Flores sent me her home address and confirmed she could see Natalie tomorrow afternoon if we could get her there without raising suspicion. She also provided a detailed list of what documentation she'd need to create a medical record that would hold up in court. Photographs with scale references, detailed written descriptions of injuries, including measurements and characteristics. Documentation of Natalie's account of how each injury was sustained, and notes about her psychological state and any observable signs of trauma beyond the physical injuries. Raymond Kim's message was longer and more detailed than I'd expected. He explained that Blake Porter had been on his radar for about 18 months, ever since a woman named Jessica Torres had filed a complaint about workplace harassment that included allegations of physical intimidation. The complaint had been investigated by Porter Financial Group's internal human resources department, but the investigation had concluded that the allegations were unsubstantiated and likely motivated by Jessica's poor performance reviews and pending termination. Jessica had been fired 2 weeks after filing the complaint, and she'd signed a settlement agreement that included a non-disclosure provision in exchange for a severance package. What made Raymond suspicious was that Jessica's complaint had included specific details about Blake's behavior that matched patterns he'd seen in other domestic violence cases. The way Blake cornered people in empty conference rooms or parking garages where there were no witnesses. The escalation from verbal intimidation to physical contact that stopped just short of assault that could be definitively proven. The threats about ruining careers and reputations if victims reported his behavior or failed to comply with his demands. These weren't the actions of someone who'd had one bad interaction with a difficult employee. These were the tactics of a predator who'd learned how to operate right at the edge of what could be legally proven while maximizing fear and control. Raymond had tried to follow up on the case, but Jessica had refused to talk to him once the settlement was finalized. Her lawyer had made it clear that any attempt to reopen the investigation would violate the terms of her agreement and expose her to significant financial penalties that she couldn't afford to pay. The case had gone cold, but Raymond had kept his notes and maintained his suspicion that Blake Porter was someone who would eventually hurt someone badly enough that the evidence would be undeniable and the consequences unavoidable. "Now I'm wondering if that someone is your family member," Raymond's message concluded. "If she's willing to file a formal complaint, I can reopen my investigation into Blake's pattern of behavior. Jessica's NDA probably wouldn't protect Blake if we can establish that he's committed crimes beyond what was covered in her settlement. And having multiple victims willing to testify creates a pattern that's much harder for expensive lawyers to dismiss as misunderstandings or personality conflicts." The information was exactly what I needed to hear. Blake's violence wasn't limited to Natalie, which meant we weren't just dealing with an isolated case of domestic abuse that might be dismissed as a private marital matter. We were dealing with a serial predator who'd been getting away with violent and controlling behavior for years, protected by family money and influence that had buried previous complaints before they could gain traction. But patterns like Blake's had a weakness. Eventually, the victims accumulated to a point where the weight of evidence became overwhelming, and the protective barriers crumbled. I drafted a careful response to Raymond, thanking him for the information, and confirming that my family member was indeed dealing with Blake Porter. I explained that I was in the process of documenting current injuries and building a timeline of abuse that would support a formal complaint. I also asked if he could provide any information about how to approach Jessica Torres in a way that wouldn't violate her NDA, but might open the door to her cooperation if criminal charges were eventually filed. The key was making sure that when Natalie was ready to go public with her accusations, we'd have corroborating testimony from other victims that would make Blake's defense strategy much more difficult. As evening progressed into night, family members began making their departures. Aunts and uncles gathered their children and collected dishes they'd brought, exchanging hugs and promises to see each other again soon. The house gradually emptied until only my parents, Natalie, Blake, and I remained. My mom started the process of cleaning up, and Natalie automatically moved to help her despite Blake's suggestion that she should rest since she'd been on her feet helping with dinner preparation all afternoon. "I'll help Mom," I said quickly, intercepting Natalie before she could reach the kitchen. "You and Blake have had a long day with the drive and everything. Why don't you two head to the guest room and get settled for the night?" Blake looked like he wanted to object, probably preferring to keep Natalie visible and under his control rather than letting her out of his sight, but refusing my suggestion would have seemed strange and controlling to my parents. He smiled that practiced smile and put his arm around Natalie's shoulders in a gesture that looked protective, but that I knew was possessive. "You're right. We should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a busy day with all those phone calls I need to make for work." The guest room was at the far end of the hallway, isolated from the main bedrooms in a way that would give them privacy, but that also meant Natalie would be alone with Blake, without anyone close enough to hear if there were problems. The arrangement made me deeply uncomfortable, but I also knew that any attempt to change the sleeping arrangements would raise questions I wasn't ready to answer yet. Instead, I made a mental note to position myself where I'd hear any disturbances and to stay alert throughout the night. Once they'd disappeared down the hallway and I heard the guest room door close, I helped my mum with the cleanup while my dad secured the house for the night. We worked in silence for several minutes, loading the dishwasher and wrapping leftovers and wiping down counters. My mum kept glancing toward the hallway where Natalie had disappeared, her maternal instinct clearly picking up on something being wrong even if she didn't yet know the specific details. "Mom, I need to tell you something," I said quietly, setting down the dish towel I'd been using. "And I need you to stay calm and quiet when I do, and Natalie and Blake can probably hear us if we're too loud." My mother's hands stilled in the soapy water where she'd been washing serving dishes. Her eyes met mine, and I saw fear and resignation there, as if she'd been expecting this conversation but had been dreading it arriving. "It's Blake, isn't it? He's hurting her?" The directness of the question shouldn't have surprised me. My mother had been a nurse for 40 years, and she'd seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize the signs when they appeared in her own daughter. "Yes," I confirmed. "He's been abusing her physically and psychologically for at least the last year, probably longer. She told me today, showed me injuries she's been hiding. I'm working on getting her out safely, but I need your help to do it right." My mother's face crumpled and she gripped the edge of the sink to steady herself. Tears spilled down her cheeks as years of suspicion and worry crystallized into confirmed horror. My baby girl, all this time, and I couldn't protect her. I should have known. I should have done something. "You couldn't have known because she was hiding it, and she was hiding it because Blake conditioned her to protect his secret," I said firmly. "This isn't your fault or Dad's fault or anyone's fault except Blake's. But now that we know, we can act. And that's where I need you to focus your energy, not on guilt about the past, but on helping Natalie have a future free from his violence." My dad entered the kitchen and immediately understood from my mum's tears that I'd told her. He moved to her side, wrapping his arms around her in the kind of solid, comforting embrace they'd perfected over 40 years of marriage. They stood there together for a moment, processing the knowledge that their daughter had been suffering while they'd been deceived by a predator's charm and manipulation. "What can I do?" my mum finally asked, pulling herself together with visible effort. "Tell me what I can do to help her. Tomorrow, I want you to invite Natalie to go Black Friday shopping," I explained, laying out the plan my dad and I had discussed in the garage. "Make it sound spontaneous and fun, like a mother-daughter tradition you want to start. Blake won't be able to refuse without looking controlling, and it gives me a window to handle some things that need to happen without him knowing. While you're out with Natalie, I'll be taking care of logistics that will help keep her safe when she's ready to leave him." My mum nodded, wiping her eyes and straightening her posture in that way she had when she needed to switch from emotional processing to practical problem solving. "I can do that. But Mark, what happens after tomorrow? What's the end game here? Because if we help her leave and Blake comes after her, if his family uses their money and lawyers to hurt her, I need to know we have a plan to protect her." "The end game is that Blake Porter faces consequences for what he's done," I said with quiet certainty. "Legal consequences, professional consequences, social consequences. By the time we're finished, his carefully constructed life will be demolished, and Natalie will be free and safe and surrounded by people who will never let him touch her again. I've dealt with men far more dangerous than Blake Porter, and I've always made sure they faced appropriate accountability for their actions. This time won't be any different." My phone alarm chimed softly, indicating it was approaching 10 o'clock and Derek's scheduled call would be coming through soon. "I need to take this call in private," I told my parents. "It's someone who can help with resources and planning. Get some rest if you can, and remember that tomorrow we all need to act completely normal around Blake. No hint that anything has changed. Can you both do that?" They nodded in unison, united in purpose the way they'd been throughout their marriage when facing challenges together. I squeezed my mom's shoulder and clasped my dad's hand briefly, then headed outside to the back porch where I could talk without any risk of being overheard. The November night air was cool and clear, and the stars were visible in ways they never were in Austin with its urban light pollution. I stood there looking up at that vast sky, thinking about all the nights I'd spent in hostile territory under similar stars, carrying out missions that seemed impossible, until they were accomplished through planning, training, and absolute commitment to the objective. My phone rang exactly at 10 o'clock. Derek's timing was military precise as always. Derek's voice came through the line with the familiar confidence of someone who'd been in worse situations and always found a way through. "Talk to me, brother. What's the situation and what do you need?" I spent the next 20 minutes laying out everything I'd discovered about Natalie's situation. From the initial bathroom confrontation, to the evidence I'd already started gathering, to the information Raymond Kim had provided about Blake's pattern of predatory behavior. Derek listened without interrupting, his silence punctuated only by occasional sounds that indicated he was taking notes or processing information. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment before responding with the kind of tactical assessment that came from years of planning high-risk operations. First thing you need to understand is that this guy isn't just an abuser, he's a strategic predator, Derek said. The workplace harassment, the careful control mechanisms, the way he's isolated Natalie while maintaining his public image. This is someone who's been getting away with this behavior for years because he understands how to operate in spaces where traditional law enforcement and social consequences don't reach him effectively. Taking him down isn't just about gathering evidence. It's about dismantling his support systems and cutting off his escape routes before he knows he's being targeted. That's exactly what I was thinking, I confirmed. But I need to move fast because every day Natalie spends in that house is another day she's at risk. Blake already knows something is off. He's going to be hyper-vigilant about controlling her access to family and monitoring any changes in her behavior. If he suspects she's planning to leave or that we know what he's been doing, he'll either escalate the violence or find ways to move her somewhere we can't easily reach her. Derek made a sound of agreement. Here's what I can provide from my end. I've got a buddy who works with a domestic violence extraction team out of San Antonio. They specialize in high-risk situations where the abuser has resources and connections that make normal safe house protocols insufficient. They can provide secure housing for Natalie that Blake won't be able to track, plus legal support and counseling services designed specifically for victims leaving dangerous relationships. I can have them on standby by tomorrow morning. That would be incredibly helpful, I said, feeling some of the weight lift from my shoulders, knowing that professional resources would be available when Natalie was ready to leave. What about documentation and evidence gathering? I'm planning to install surveillance equipment at their house tomorrow while Blake is distracted, but I want to make sure I'm using protocols that will make the footage admissible if this goes to trial. Derek paused, and I could hear the sound of typing in the background. Surveillance in a private residence where you're not a resident gets legally complicated. You need to make sure Natalie gives explicit consent to the recording, and ideally you want that consent documented in a way that proves she knew what was being installed and why. Otherwise, a good defense attorney will argue that any footage obtained violated privacy laws and should be excluded from evidence. He was right, and I mentally adjusted my plan to include getting Natalie's written consent before installing any equipment. What about the recordings I make when I visit their house? If Blake does something while I'm there as a guest, is that legally permissible? That's much cleaner from a legal standpoint, Derek confirmed. You're a guest in the home, and you have every right to record your own interactions and anything you directly witness. Just make sure your recording device is on your person and that you're not hiding cameras in areas where there's a reasonable expectation of privacy, like bathrooms or bedrooms. Anything that happens in common areas while you're present as an invited guest is fair game. I made mental notes of all of this, grateful for Derek's understanding of the legal complexities involved. What about confronting Blake directly? I know the smart play is to let law enforcement handle it once we have enough evidence, but there's a part of me that wants him to understand on a very personal level that he picked the wrong person's sister to hurt. Derek laughed, a dark sound that acknowledged the impulse while recognizing its complications. I get it, brother. I felt the same way about people who hurt innocents. But you need to think strategically about what serves Natalie's interests versus what satisfies your need for immediate justice. If you confront Blake before the legal case is solid, you risk giving him warning that allows him to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, or create counter-narratives that muddy the waters. Plus, if you put hands on him in anger, even justified anger, you potentially open yourself up to assault charges that his family's lawyers would love to use to discredit everything else you're trying to accomplish. Everything he said made tactical sense, but it didn't address the deeper issue that had been burning in my chest since finding Natalie in that bathroom. This isn't just about legal consequences or even keeping Natalie safe going forward. This is about making sure Blake understands that his actions have created an enemy he can't buy off or manipulate or intimidate. I need him to feel a fraction of the fear Natalie has been living with for years. There was another pause, longer this time, before Derek responded. Okay, I hear you. And I'm not going to tell you that righteous anger doesn't have its place in situations like this. But if you're going to confront him, it needs to be calculated and controlled. Make it psychological rather than physical. Let him know that you've documented everything, that you have resources he can't match, and that his comfortable life is about to become very uncomfortable. Fear of consequences and loss of control is often more effective with guys like Blake than actual violence, because violence is temporary, but the knowledge that someone has power over you is persistent. I considered this approach, recognizing the wisdom in it even as my protective instincts pushed for more immediate and visceral justice. So you're saying I make it clear that I own him now, that every move he makes is being watched and documented, that the walls are closing in, and there's nothing his family's money or influence can do to stop what's coming. Exactly, Derek confirmed. And here's the thing about guys like Blake who've built their identity on control and dominance. Taking away their sense of power is often more devastating than any physical beating could be. When he realizes that he's not the predator anymore, that he's become the prey, that psychological shift will be more damaging to him than a few bruises that heal in a week. The conversation shifted to specific tactical considerations. Derek walked me through the types of surveillance equipment that would be most effective for documenting Blake's behavior while remaining undetectable, even to someone who might be actively looking for monitoring devices. He provided contacts for forensic specialists who could analyze any digital evidence we gathered to ensure chain of custody protocols were followed. He also offered to reach out to his network of veterans who'd transitioned into private security work, creating a pool of trained personnel who could provide protective surveillance for Natalie if Blake's behavior escalated after she left. By the time we finished the call, I had a comprehensive operational plan that addressed both Natalie's immediate safety needs and the longer-term goal of ensuring Blake faced meaningful consequences for his actions. Derek promised to have his contacts ready to deploy by Saturday morning, giving me a tight but manageable timeline to gather initial evidence and convince Natalie that leaving was both possible and necessary. We ended the call the way we always did, with the simple phrase that had carried us through combat deployments and difficult transitions. Stay safe, brother. I stood on the porch for several more minutes after the call ended, letting the cool night air clear my head while I mentally organized the next 24 hours. Tomorrow morning, my mom would extend the Black Friday shopping invitation to Natalie. While they were out, I'd make the 3-hour drive to Lakewood and conduct surveillance on Blake's activities when he thought no one was watching. I'd also use that time to gather any additional evidence from their home that might support our case, being careful to only take items or documents that Natalie would explicitly authorize me to collect. Tomorrow afternoon, I'd get Natalie to Dr. Flores for the medical documentation that would create an official record of her injuries. That appointment needed to happen away from Blake's awareness, which meant careful coordination with my mom to ensure Natalie's absence seemed natural and wouldn't trigger his control mechanisms. The shopping trip would provide cover, and if Blake questioned why they were gone longer than expected, my mom could claim they'd lost track of time or decided to grab lunch while they were out. Tomorrow evening would be the critical juncture. That's when I'd need to have a serious conversation with Natalie about leaving, about accepting help from the resources Derek was arranging, and about being willing to follow through with formal complaints to law enforcement, despite her fear of Blake's retaliation. I knew from experience with trauma victims that this conversation couldn't be rushed or forced. Natalie needed to feel like she was making her own choices, rather than being pressured by yet another person trying to control her decisions. But I also knew that every day she stayed with Blake was another day of danger, and that sometimes people needed someone they trusted to clearly articulate what their options were and what support was available. A sound from inside the house caught my attention, the distinctive creak of the hallway floorboards that indicated someone was moving around. I moved quietly to the back door and peered for the window, seeing Natalie emerge from the guest room dressed in pajamas and moving with the careful stealth of someone trying not to wake their partner. She headed toward the kitchen, probably seeking water or a snack, and I seized the opportunity for a private conversation. I entered through the back door as she was filling a glass at the sink. She startled at the sound, nearly dropping the glass before recognizing me. Jesus, Mark, you scared me half to death. I thought you'd gone to bed already. Couldn't sleep, I said quietly, moving to join her by the sink while keeping my voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the guest room. Too much on my mind. How are you holding up? Natalie's hands trembled slightly as she set down the glass. I keep thinking about what you said earlier, about how this ends now, about having resources and a plan. Part of me wants to believe it's possible to actually get away from him. But another part of me knows how powerful his family is, how many times he's threatened what would happen if I tried to leave. He's told me stories about other people who crossed them, people who lost everything. I'm terrified, Mark, not just of him, but of what happens when I disrupt his world. Fear is a reasonable response to a dangerous situation, I acknowledged. But you need to understand something about bullies and abusers who rely on fear to maintain control. Their power exists only as long as their victims believe escape is impossible and resistance is futile. The moment you call that bluff, the moment you demonstrate that you have resources and support they didn't anticipate, their entire framework collapses. Blake has been operating in an environment where he's never faced real consequences because his victims were isolated and convinced no one would believe them over him. But you're not isolated anymore. She looked at me with eyes that held years of accumulated pain and fear. What if it doesn't work? What if we try to build this case and his lawyers tear it apart? What if I lose my job and my house and end up with nothing while he goes back to his comfortable life like nothing happened? The questions reflected trauma conditioning, the way Blake had systematically destroyed her confidence and convinced her that she deserved the abuse or that escape would only make things worse. I'd seen similar patterns in veterans with PTSD who'd internalized the belief that they were fundamentally broken and that seeking help would only confirm their inadequacy. Breaking through that conditioning required patience, consistency, and absolute certainty in offering an alternative narrative. Here's what I know with complete certainty, I said, holding her gaze. Tomorrow you're going to have medical documentation of your injuries created by a doctor who specializes in domestic violence cases. That documentation will be time-stamped and detailed and completely objective. You're going to have photographs that show the bruising and damage in ways that can't be explained away as accidents or clumsiness. You're going to have a detective who's already suspicious of Blake's pattern of behavior and who wants to build a case that finally holds him accountable. And you're going to have me, someone who's trained in tactics and strategy and who will not stop until you're safe, and he's facing consequences. Natalie's eyes filled with tears, but these were different from the defeated crying I'd heard in the bathroom earlier. These seemed to carry a hint of hope, mixed with the fear, as if she was allowing herself to imagine a future that didn't include constant violence and degradation. What do I have to do tomorrow? I walked her through the plan step by step, explaining the shopping trip cover story, the medical appointment with Dr. Flores, and the importance of documenting everything she could remember about Blake's abuse, including dates, locations, witnesses, and any evidence that might still exist, like threatening text messages or emails. I also explained that Derek was arranging secure housing through specialists who dealt with high-risk domestic violence situations, and that when she was ready to leave, she'd have a safe place to go, where Blake couldn't find her. The last part is the hardest, I said gently. At some point, probably in the next few days, you're going to have to make the choice to actually leave, to pack what you can carry and walk away from that house and that marriage and the life you thought you were building. Blake is going to try to stop you. He's going to make promises and threats in equal measure. He's going to tell you that you're overreacting, that things will get better, that you're throwing away everything good over temporary problems. And you're going to have to choose to believe me and the evidence we've gathered over the lies he's conditioned you to accept. She wrapped her arms around herself in that protective gesture I'd noticed earlier. What if I'm not strong enough? What if I get scared and change my mind? Then we'll try again, I said simply. Leaving an abusive relationship often takes multiple attempts before it sticks. But each attempt gets easier because you've proven to yourself that escape is possible, even if it's not yet permanent. The important thing is that you know you have support and resources waiting whenever you're ready to use them. There's no judgment here, Natalie, only commitment to making sure you survive this and come out the other side stronger than Blake ever imagined you could be. We stood there in my parents' kitchen in the quiet hours before dawn, brother and sister united against a threat that had seemed insurmountable just hours earlier. Natalie finished her water and rinsed the glass, then moved toward the hallway that would take her back to the guest room where Blake slept. Before she left, she turned back to me with an expression that mixed gratitude and determination. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing what was happening even when I was trying so hard to hide it. I don't know if I can do this, but knowing you believe I can makes me want to try." She disappeared down the hallway, and I heard the guest room door open and close quietly. I remained in the kitchen for another few minutes, running through mental checklists of everything that needed to happen tomorrow and contingency plans for complications that might arise. Then I made my way to my own room, the childhood bedroom that my parents had maintained exactly as I'd left it when I joined the Navy at 18. Posters of athletes and action movies still decorated the walls. Trophies from high school football sat on shelves alongside photographs of friends who'd scattered across the country pursuing their own lives. I set my phone alarm for 6 in the morning, early enough to be awake before Blake emerged from the guest room, but not so early that it would seem suspicious if anyone noticed. Then I lay down fully clothed on top of the covers, knowing that sleep would be difficult, but that rest was necessary if I was going to execute tomorrow's operations effectively. My mind cycled through tactical considerations and potential complications, running scenarios the way I'd been trained to do before missions in hostile territory. The house settled into the deep quiet of late night, broken only by the familiar sounds of the old ranch house adjusting to temperature changes and the distant noise of nocturnal animals in the property's wooded areas. I must have dozed eventually because I became aware of my phone alarm chirping softly in the pre-dawn darkness. I silenced it immediately and lay there for a moment, orienting myself and listening for any indication that others in the house were awake. Everything was still quiet, which meant I had time to prepare before the day's activities began. I slipped out of my room and made my way to the bathroom, moving with the silent precision that had been drilled into me during years of operating in environments where noise discipline could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic compromise. After a quick shower and change into fresh clothes, I headed to the kitchen to start coffee. My parents would be up soon, and we'd need to coordinate our approach to the day before Blake and Natalie emerged from the guest room. My dad appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:30, already dressed and alert despite the early hour. His firefighter training had instilled the same ability to wake quickly and transition from sleep to full awareness that my military training had developed. We exchanged nods of greeting, and he poured himself coffee while I pulled out my laptop to review the notes I'd compiled about Blake's workplace, his typical schedule, and the security systems at their house in Lakewood. "Your mother didn't sleep much," my dad said quietly. "She spent most of the night reading about domestic violence and trauma responses, trying to understand what Natalie has been going through. This morning she's determined to do everything exactly right so that we don't accidentally make things worse." "That's good," I said, meaning it. Having my mom educated about trauma responses would make her more effective at supporting Natalie without overwhelming her with questions or expectations. "What time do you think she'll extend the shopping invitation?" "Probably right after breakfast," my dad replied. "She's planning to make it sound spontaneous, like she just woke up excited about the idea of a mother-daughter outing for Black Friday deals. Blake won't be able to object without seeming controlling or unreasonable, especially since your mother will frame it as a special bonding opportunity that doesn't happen often enough with Natalie living 3 hours away." My mum entered the kitchen at that moment, her expression showing the strain of a sleepless night, but also the determined focus of someone who'd decided on a course of action. She moved to hug me without speaking, holding on longer than usual as if drawing strength from the physical contact. When she pulled back, her eyes were clear and purposeful. "I've been thinking about how to approach this morning," she said. "I'm going to make a big breakfast, all of Natalie's childhood favorites. While we're eating, I'll mention casually that I saw advertisements for Black Friday sales at some of the stores she used to love when she was younger. Then I'll suggest we make a day of it, just the two of us, like we used to do before she got married. If Blake objects or tries to create complications, I'll be pleasantly persistent but not aggressive about it. Does that sound right?" "That sounds perfect," I confirmed. "The key is making it seem like a normal mom impulse rather than a strategic maneuver. Blake is going to be looking for signs that something has changed or that we're acting differently around him. The more natural and casual everything seems, the less likely he is to suspect that we know what he's been doing." We spent the next hour coordinating details and making sure everyone understood their roles for the day. My dad would keep Blake occupied with conversations about football and household projects, giving him attention and engagement that would make him less likely to focus on what the women were doing. I would maintain my typical younger brother presence, friendly, but not overly interested in Blake's activities, ready to step in if needed, but otherwise appearing preoccupied with my own plans for the day. At 7:30, we heard movement from the hallway, indicating that Blake and Natalie were awake. My mom immediately shifted into hostess mode, pulling out ingredients for French toast and bacon, while talking cheerfully about how wonderful it was to have everyone together for the holiday weekend. Blake emerged first, already dressed in expensive casual wear that managed to look both relaxed and carefully curated. He accepted coffee from my mom with his practiced charm, commenting on how well he'd slept and how comfortable the guest room was. Natalie appeared a few minutes later, moving carefully in ways that suggested her injuries were causing pain she was trying to hide. She'd applied makeup with more attention than usual, no doubt trying to cover any visible bruising that might have darkened overnight. Her smile was automatic and hollow, the performance of happiness that she'd perfected over 3 years, of concealing her reality from the people who loved her. Breakfast proceeded with the kind of cheerful family banter that my mum excelled at creating, conversations about nothing important that filled the space and kept everyone engaged without requiring deep thought or emotional investment. Blake dominated discussions as usual, holding forth on his opinions about current events and market trends with the confidence of someone who believed his perspective was inherently more valuable than anyone else's. Natalie ate sparingly, despite the array of her favorite foods, and I noticed Blake, monitoring her portions with subtle but unmistakable attention to what she consumed. As my mom cleared plates and brought out fresh coffee, she launched into her prepared script with the perfect blend of spontaneity and enthusiasm. You know what I was thinking about this morning? All those Black Friday shopping trips Natalie and I used to take when she was in high school. We'd get up early and hit all the sales, making a whole day of it with lunch and everything. I was looking at the advertisements in the paper this morning, and I'd love to do that again. Just us girls, no boys allowed to complain about how long we're taking or how many stores we're visiting. The invitation was delivered with such natural warmth that even I almost believed it was spontaneous rather than carefully planned. Natalie's face showed a flicker of genuine pleasure at the memory before uncertainty took over, her eyes automatically moving to Blake to gauge his reaction and check whether this was something she'd be permitted to enjoy. Blake's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, that micro-tension I'd been trained to recognize in hostile negotiations. That sounds nice, but Natalie and I were planning to head back to Lakewood this afternoon. I've got those client calls, and she probably needs to prepare lesson plans for next week. My mom didn't miss a beat, her voice remaining light and encouraging. Oh, those calls can be made from here, can't they? You've got your laptop and phone, and Natalie's lesson plans aren't due until Sunday evening. I promise we'll have her back by dinner time. It's been so long since we've had quality mother-daughter time. Blake opened his mouth to object again, but my dad smoothly intervened. Actually, Blake, I was hoping you could help me with something in the garage. I've been trying to figure out this new power tool system, and you mentioned you'd done some renovation work at your place. Would love to get your expert opinion while the ladies are out shopping. The combination of my mum's persistent cheerfulness and my dad's flattery created a social trap that Blake couldn't escape without revealing his controlling nature. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Of course. That sounds great. Natalie, you should definitely go with your mom. Have fun with the shopping. Natalie's relief was visible for just a moment before she concealed it behind practiced enthusiasm. That would be wonderful, Mom. I'd love to spend the day with you. 2 hours later, I watched my mum's Honda pull out of the driveway with Natalie in the passenger seat. Blake stood on the porch beside me, waving goodbye with his hand resting possessively on my shoulder, in a gesture that probably looked friendly, but felt like a dominance display. The moment their car disappeared around the corner, I felt his grip tighten slightly before he released me and headed back inside to make his business calls. I gave him 30 minutes to get settled in the guest room with his laptop before I made my own exit, telling my dad I had some errands to run in Austin and would be back by evening. Blake barely acknowledged my departure, too focused on whatever financial maneuvering he was conducting to care about my movements. That indifference was exactly what I'd been counting on. The 3-hour drive to Lakewood gave me time to review everything Derek had sent overnight. Surveillance equipment specifications, legal documentation templates for Natalie to sign, authorizing the monitoring contact information for the domestic violence extraction team standing by in San Antonio. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of a shopping center 2 blocks from Blake and Natalie's house, I had a complete operational plan mapped out in my mind. Their home in Pinehurst Estates was exactly what I'd expected from Blake's personality, a showcase property designed to impress rather than comfort. I'd been there twice before for brief visits, enough to memorize the layout, and identified the security system's weaknesses. The alarm company they used was one I'd consulted for previously, which meant I knew exactly how to bypass their protocols without triggering alerts. Entry took less than 3 minutes. The surveillance equipment installation took 45. I placed cameras in the living room, kitchen, and home office, positioning them in smoke detectors and electrical outlets where they'd be completely invisible unless someone knew precisely where to look and had the technical expertise to identify military-grade equipment. Each unit connected to an encrypted cloud server that only Natalie and I could access, with backup storage that would preserve footage even if Blake discovered and destroyed the devices. While I worked, I photographed documents I found in Blake's home office, financial records showing unexplained cash withdrawals that matched the timeline of Natalie's injuries, emails from his uncle's law firm discussing the Jessica Torres settlement in language that made clear this wasn't Blake's first incident requiring expensive legal intervention, a journal Blake kept that detailed his frustrations with Natalie in language that was chilling in its casual description of violence as justified discipline. By early afternoon, I was done. The house looked exactly as I'd found it, with no trace of my presence except for the watching eyes I'd left behind. I locked up and drove to Dr. Flores's home office, arriving just as my mum's car pulled into the driveway. The medical examination took 90 minutes. Dr. Flores was thorough and gentle, photographing injuries with clinical precision while maintaining the compassionate presence that made Natalie feel safe enough to describe 3 years of escalating abuse. Broken ribs that had healed improperly, scars from cigarette burns Blake had inflicted during arguments, bruising in patterns consistent with being grabbed, shaken, and struck repeatedly. When we finished, Dr. Flores handed Natalie a folder containing copies of all documentation. "This is yours," she said firmly. "Evidence that what happened to you was real and criminal. No one can take this truth away from you now." The drive back to Cedar Park was quiet. Natalie sat in the backseat of my mum's car, holding that folder like it was both a lifeline and a weapon. When we arrived at my parents' house, Blake was waiting on the porch, his expression pleasant but his eyes cold with suspicion. "Did you ladies have fun shopping?" he asked, his tone carrying an edge that suggested he knew they'd been gone longer than typical retail therapy required. My mum launched into an elaborate story about unexpected sales and a long lunch, her nursing background making her a surprisingly effective liar when protecting her daughter. Blake listened with that calculated smile, but I saw him studying Natalie for signs of deception or defiance. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I received a text from Derek. "Extraction team is ready. Safe house confirmed. Legal team standing by. Just say the word." I looked at my phone, then at the guest room door where my sister was sleeping beside the man who'd been destroying her for 3 years. Tomorrow I'd give her the choice. Leave now with support and protection, or wait until she was ready. Either way, Blake Porter's days of unchallenged violence were over, because I hadn't spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL learning to protect innocent people just to stand by while someone hurt my sister. The mission parameters were clear: extract the victim, neutralize the threat, ensure lasting consequences. Blake thought his money and connections made him untouchable. He was about to learn that some brothers don't need permission to become their sister's guardian. They just need the right moment and the will to act. And that moment was coming faster than Blake Porter could possibly imagine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.